Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're going to get started with a word of prayer so that we can move on with all the great things we have planned for you tonight. So let's pray. Father, we are grateful to call on your name, grateful that we get to come together across the nation, across various places with one same purpose and in one accord. We just pray that as we talk today, as we hear stories, as we share, that your spirit would guide everything that we do, that you would be present and visit us in our homes, and that this would be helpful for each one of us. We pray for each one of our panelists, Lord, that you would be the one that speaks through them, and this can be good for the building up of more women in leadership, for us to know that we have allies and we have those who are male advocates that help us to live into the purpose and the fullness of potential that you have for us. God, we thank you in advance for what you're going to do and the outcome of all the conversations we're going to have. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to take a minute to introduce AWL and tell you a little bit about who we are and why we're here. It is difficult to tell the history of advocacy for women in the Free Methodist Church because those of us on this team stand on the shoulders of so many women who have walked this path. When exactly did advocacy start? With the first Free Methodist woman who woke up one morning and said, "This is not right. I'm going to do something." Many others have done something since, and we are only the latest. We are grateful for their tireless, courageous work of education and advocacy. We build on it. And so here we are. In 2021, 6 of us as a core team began monthly meetings to decide what that something would be. We quickly determined it had to include resources for our pastors and leaders to learn more about the culture in North America and how it affects women, especially the church culture. We needed to talk honestly about what we've experienced and allow those stories to be heard unvarnished. We wanted a gathering place for women in the Free Methodist Church to feel heard, seen, valued, and energized. Above all, we want to advocate for women to be treated with the dignity and equality afforded to Ezer Kenigdo, images of God, in the church, in leadership, in marriage, everywhere. AWL's goal, then, is to lead the Free Methodist Church towards an egalitarian culture in its entirety, including marriage and ordination, theory and practice. We want to move towards this goal in a way that takes into account all women's experiences, no matter our race, age, marital status, appearance, or disabilities. We plan to do this by providing a connection space for women harmed by sexism within the Free Methodist Church, by facilitating women's healing and empowerment, by offering resources for women and men on a journey of repentance and change regarding our biases, and by providing FMC women with knowledge of opportunities for growth. Our immediate twofold agenda has been to provide a blog where FMC women can tell their stories publicly but anonymously, both to facilitate women's healing and to make women's shared experiences visible within the denomination. We hope that this will help women feel empowered and believed, and also raise awareness about the need for our group. Secondly, we aim to provide a path of resources for education about sexism and sexist systems for those who want to join us in recognizing and dismantling them. Ultimately, we would like women to be seen as vital assets to the denomination. We also provide advocacy in 3 different ways. If you are experiencing sexism and need a safe place to process your options, we will meet with you and brainstorm. Our goal will not be to tell you what to do, but to support you as you discern what God would have you do. If you are being called into a meeting where the power dynamics are not in your favor, and you are worried about being bullied or silenced, one of us from outside your conference will attend the meeting with you. We can show up as just a silent witness, or we can speak, whatever you prefer. If you are aware of a practice that falls outside of God's best for women in the Free Methodist Church, and you need someone besides you to draw attention to it, Say the speaker invited to speak at a retreat doesn't believe in mutual submission in marriage. Let us know, and we will speak up to the people in charge. So that's who we are. Now for tonight. In just a minute, Katie is going to introduce our panelists, but we want you to know that we have an assignment for those of you in the audience, and Jill is going to share that with you.
Good evening. So your assignments very specifically tonight for the men who are here. We would like you to make note of who is here and who is not. The men who are here are probably available and interested to brainstorm and talk with you about how to maybe overcome biases and become better advocates together. We recognize this is a journey that every single one of us is on. And the men who are not here, maybe they're busy, maybe they're unaware, or maybe they just need your nudge a little bit to think about this. For women, we hope that you will think about two questions that we're going to give to you. One, what is one thing you wish male advocates knew? And two, how have you seen male advocates effectively making space for you and other women? And you're going to have the opportunity to answer those questions anonymously now and during this panel, and your answers will be shared at the end of our time together anonymously. So I'm going to throw a link in the chat that will help you to, and then while you're thinking about that, while the men are speaking, you can click on that link and share your answers. On to Katie.
All right, I'm going to briefly introduce our four panelists. Thank you so much for you all for coming. We're so glad to hear from these men who are serious about being advocates for women and leadership in the Free Methodist Church. So first we have Reverend Jeffery D. Harold. Jeff is the founding pastor of New Beginnings Community Church of Washtenaw County in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Additionally, through the Ministry of Intentionality LLC, he seeks to help individuals, churches, and organizations increase their intercultural competency, engage in meaningful and transformative conversations about race, and develop intentional strategies for implementing justice in their communities. Our next panelist is Jon Sato. Jon Sato is the superintendent of the Free Methodist Church in Southern California and a lifelong member of the Free Methodist Church. He earned a BA in psychology from Azusa Pacific University, followed by a Master's of Divinity from Azusa Pacific Seminary, and later completed a Master of Business Administration from Boston University. Alongside his professional endeavors, Jon finds joy in family life. He and his wife Jen are the proud parents of three daughters, Adeline, Charlotte, and Eleanor. Our next panelist is Scott Sittig. Scott and his wife and one remaining busy teenager live in the Maplewood district of Rochester, New York, where they frequent the Maplewood Rose Garden on morning walks with their energetic Labrador. Their four other kids are mostly out of the house, with one in college. Their family rounds out with two wonderful daughters-in-law and two awesome grandkids. Scott's day jobs include being a part-time pastor at a dynamic urban intercultural church, New Hope, and working full-time for the United Way of Greater Rochester. He's a graduate of Northeastern Seminary and the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. His undergrad was completed at Roberts Wesleyan University. And finally, Denny Wayman. Denny Wayman is retired pastor of the Free Methodist Church of Santa Barbara and lead superintendent of the Free Methodist Church in Southern California. Denny and Cheryl served the Free Methodist Church in Santa Barbara for 40 years. Denny was lead pastor and Cheryl directed the Church Counseling Center as a licensed therapist. Denny served 8 years as the lead superintendent of the Free Methodist Church in Southern California. He has authored 5 books, with another coming out this fall. He co-wrote a newspaper column on film for 20 years and has served on the Study Commission on Doctrine since 1988. Denny and Cheryl have 2 sons and 5 grandchildren. Thank you so much, panelists. Amelia Cleveland Trailer and Heather Baker Utley will be interviewing our panelists, so I will hand it over to them.
All right, so we'll begin with our very first question, which is actually being addressed to all 4 of the panelists. This is just a reminder to them that the order that they'll speak is Jeff, Jon, Scott, then Denny. Okay, that's true for the first 2 questions. So we'll begin with this one. Tell us the elevator pitch version of your journey toward being an advocate. Each of you will have 2 minutes to share your answers.
Well, first, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here and for the work you do on the behalf of our denomination. The short version of my pitch toward being an advocate was starting out with a strong mother who was strong in the community, but also saw how there were barriers for her in her work in the church, particularly in relation to a very strong bishop that stood in the way of her doing things that she wanted to do in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I have a very strong wife, and she is just a wonderful example of what a strong woman is. And it took me a while to get used to the fact that Monica would not let it go. She would defend herself in every type of situation. And me being one to be a peacemaker, not one to make waves, I had to step back and say, she's right, they're wrong, and just let her do her thing. I have 3 grown daughters, and I want my daughters to be strong women, and same as my granddaughters, and I really want to be there for them. And my secular work experience, my supervisors have been amazing women that have shown me just strength and leadership. Last thing, I have been members of an alliance at past that would not admit women. And I actually resigned that alliance because of that. So I've seen the talents of women marginalized basically because men just didn't want to make a way for them or thought they were lesser than.
Yeah, I'll echo Jeff's statements and thank you for having us all and the opportunity to kind of speak. It's kind of a funny question for me personally. I think when Pastor Katie reached out and said, you've been recommended as an advocate for women, my journey to advocacy is still in process. I wouldn't consider myself an advocate. I would consider myself a broken leader who is trying to learn and figure out life and my biases and the things that I carry with me as a person. I can tell you that I was born and raised in the Free Methodist Church. My dad was a Free Methodist minister, and my mom did ministry alongside him the entire time. And coming then to the Pacific University, obviously a Wesleyan university, and but growing up in kind of a Baptist context when it comes to my education, I really didn't understand how the Reformed theology actually processed those types of issues. And so as the Lord has kind of continued to work in my life, I think one of the roles as being a leader is to exegete your culture and exegete what the Lord has for you. And so I think my journey towards superintendency, I think the context of the Free Methodist Church demands that any superintendent must work towards being an advocate, knowing our context, knowing our history, knowing what we believe, and knowing our current results.
Well, I knew when I was asked to be a part of this panel that I would probably share some similarities with my panelists, but John, you just said it so well. I'm on a journey, and so first of all, just thank you for the honor and the privilege of being a part and being able to share a little bit of my story with you tonight. But definitely, I've been on a journey for most of my life, and I think I owe some early awareness, and for this you could think maybe teen and preteen years, to some very strong women in my life, including my mom, those who filled in really with love after she passed away far too early. Some were teachers, some were Bible quizzing coaches, some were just moms to me, and all were strong women who led well and taught me the Bible and organized and administrated. And it was obvious to me early on that women could and should lead with the gifts that they were given. But even as a teenager and a young adult, I didn't really know how much I was already shaped by patriarchy as well. And even how my FM family acquiesced to a contented, soft complementarianism. And if you want to know more about that nuance, I would refer you to a new book by Lisa Weaver Schwartz called Stained Glass Ceilings, How Evangelicals Do Gender and Practice Power. It's extremely enlightening. Further along, when I went to work for Pastor Linda Adams, now bishop, of course, I continued to hear the subtle and not so subtle things that challenged my perceptions. For instance, I heard her challenge the views of James Dobson and critique Family Life Radio as far too complementarian in their views. These are things I didn't pay attention to, and frankly, at one point had thought that working for Focus on the Family would be a good goal in life. But I listened more carefully, at first not understanding, but growing in my awareness over time. I think my real turning point towards advocacy, from being someone on the sidelines and just passively aware, came in seminary after taking a course on gender violence. And I owe far too much to my journey to Dr. Elizabeth Gerhardt and her research into her book, The Cross and Gendercide. It was really in that class and with that book that God finally, I think, helped the scales fall off, and I was forced to confront a lot of my own bias, realizing that it ranged from the subtleties of my language, my body language, my assumptions, all the way up to and including the countless ways that I and our society gives men a pass for the downright evil and abusive behavior that we see. So the many challenges to my paradigm over the years, I've been confronted with needing to reframe my understanding of power and privilege, and ultimately recognizing that patriarchy was just one more paradigm among many that needed to both be challenged and changed. So consider myself very much on the journey.
I mean, at last, I would echo much of what has been said. It's an honor, of course, to be with women like you who are leading this organization. I am greatly admiring your work that you do. I'm a fourth generation. My kids are fifth generation Free Methodist. My father was a pastor. My mom worked side by side. It never even really occurred to me that women were not treated equally in even the Oklahoma countryside. And then I met Cheryl at Greenville College, and she's one of the most capable persons I've ever met. And I continue to admire her, and she teaches me daily. I tell people that I need daily therapy, so I had to marry a therapist. And she has been extremely helpful to me. And she, of course, grew up, I think she is also a fourth or fifth Free Methodist. And she always quotes her father as saying that if God calls a woman to be a pastor, who am I to stand in her way? And that has always been something that is kind of endemic to my faith and to the Christian life that I live. Cheryl, even just for your amusement, when we got married and she became a way man, she wrote everything way person. And so that helps us remember who she is. Then, of course, educated FM colleges at Greenville and Wesleyan Seminary at Asbury. And everything was reinforced at every level, theologically, in practical ministry, in the modeling that we saw in the classroom, in the sanctuary. And that just reinforced the power of that. In fact, I remember our president of Asbury saying one time that his two daughters and his son were talking one day, and they went to a church where there were only female pastors. And the son said, "I want to be a pastor." And the daughter said to him, "You can't be, you're not a woman." And when we model things for people, they imagine them. And if they don't ever see a model, then they can't imagine it. And then I would say what has been the great joy of my life is being able to recognize the strength and gifting and unique perspective and enrichment that women leaders have brought to the ministries that I have been a part of. My pastor is calling her to dates. She's amazing. One of the best leaders I've ever met is Jillian Schover. Deb Wackemeyer, one of the greatest scholars that I know, and I've spent hundreds of hours. We went through seminary together, and I've talked ever since, is Karen Winslow. And this is just to name a very few. I could name you in this organization as people who impact me. And Amelia, every time you preach, I am just moved by God. And And so when you experience God's presence coming through gifted women over and over and over again, from sermons to teaching to leadership to decision making, it just says, I want more of those people in the world. I want to do everything I can do, at least, to bring that about. But I would agree with Jon and Scott. It's an ongoing journey, an ongoing journey.
All right. Thank you all. You've all talked about being on a journey. And so we want to ask you to be vulnerable with us and reflect on a mistake. So can you briefly reflect on a mistake you've made or an opportunity to be an advocate that you missed? Starting with Jeff.
Yes. So we're talking being vulnerable here. It was when a meeting was called. There was a Free Methodist pastor by the name of Tasha Pryor, who was doing outstanding work in the DC area in a church plant, New Vision in the city. There were some personal things that were going on, and the next thing we heard, well, let me back up. We were at an African Heritage Network meeting, and there was a meeting of some of the men in the network that was called, and we met with her superintendent. At that point, it was Dave Harvey. And in that hotel room, it was explained why Tasha had been asked to step down because of some issues with her husband. We asked questions and wondered why, but Tasha was not invited to that meeting. And to this day, Tasha talks about the meeting y'all had about me without me there. Tasha has never made her way back into ministry from that point. And for the reasons that she was asked to step down, I have seen men with family issues keep going, flourish. Nothing said of them about taking time away, stepping down. And the big problem was her husband had problems with her being the pastor and leader. So if I look at an epic fail, it was at that point that we did not stop that meeting and say, whoa, wait a minute. We can't have this meeting without Tasha here. Because I had no clue exactly what the issue was. But I think that if that had happened, it might have backed things up some. And Tasha might still be pastoring in this denomination today. And that was, if my grandson is 15 years old, that was about 14 years ago.
Thank you, Pastor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, vulnerably, I mean, I wasn't thinking about a very specific instance. Thank you for sharing that, Jeff. I was thinking more of categorically some of the mistakes that I've made, there's many of them, but I think the one that came to mind was false equivalency. Being a person of color or Asian American in leadership is kind of rare in the Free Methodist Church. But then you kind of get bucketed together, right? And then the assumption is sometimes that I can come off, or for me, and in the way that I listen, is that I understand the experiences that a female might have being minoritized in or marginalized in a situation, and I don't. A lot of that could be because I don't have capacity to hold or lament well, or I don't listen well. But then it gives me assumptions, and I can make quick stories. I could do a lot of things that are really poor and not good leadership. And so I think in a lot of ways, the thing that is really easy for me to fall into is assuming that I understand the experiences of a female.
Thank you, Pastor Jon.
So I think for me, I've gotten far more wrong than I've gotten right. This question was kind of easy for me to answer, but I did kind of think about it in two ways. One was more personal and one is a little bit more on the professional side. So the way I would kind of think about this was first, I kind of have to start with my own wife. And I can honestly say, again, being vulnerable here, I brought patriarchy and complementarian thinking and lifestyles into my marriage without really even realizing it. Again, I'm born and bred and kind of like you, Denny, multiple generations FM. But I feel like that was sort of bred into me. And to be frank, that still confounds me a little bit. I struggled for many years in my early marriage, more than I want to admit, to view my wife through the lens of being co-equal. Early on, it was probably way more obvious in the things that I expected of her, while I allowed myself freedoms that went unquestioned. But not too long into marriage, when those freedoms were questioned, because my wife is very strong and beautiful woman, then it turned into attitudes that I offered when things didn't go my way. So, and I think honestly, if she were here on this call with me, she would also tell you that she was bred in similar ways, because we've kind of lamented that together. And neither of us really knew much about how to change it for years. I think we both kind of assumed that that's how it was supposed to be, but we also felt like it wasn't right. And so we've spent a lot of our marriage trying to figure that out. So mistakes I have made, definitely personally, and I can honestly say that there were definitely some missed opportunities on her part, because I elevated my goals and my dreams above hers. And then just briefly, I'll say professionally and pastorally, I also thought that I elevated women and gave them opportunities. I've not been a pastor all my life. It's been more recent, and I thought I was doing a decent job. But with what I know now, when I reflect, I realized that when I thought I was elevating, I was still rooted in patriarchal paradigms that did not center their needs, did not center their goals, did not center their ways of doing things above those that made sense to me. In other words, I still centered on historically male-dominated pathways, male voices, historically male approaches, without realizing it. And too often I categorized reasons or explanations or expressed accommodations from women through a lens maybe of inferiority, which sounds pretty harsh. I hate to say it out loud, but that's the truth. In the moment, I tried not to be overt about it, of course, but I know it now still came through. The way I was thinking about it, it was more about how I interpreted it for myself. But in retrospect, I can see the countless ways that my nonverbals, my responses, and not to mention some of my actions undermined opportunities and held some women back, I believe, from true flourishing. So again, just part of the ongoing journey and being vulnerable with you all tonight.
Thank you, Pastor Scott. Denny?
It is difficult to even begin to talk about ministry without recognizing that we make errors almost every day in all of the kinds of things we have to choose and decide and counsel and all the things that we do. I would just mention a couple of things indicative of these kinds of things. I have been really helped by the leaders that I have worked with who are willing to confront me and say, hey, I'm uncomfortable. I remember specifically one day I was sitting with my regional leaders, and we were doing the male kind of joking and talking and so on, and she just spoke up and said, this is making me uncomfortable. I'm left out of this, and to some extent, I'm the brunt of your jokes. And we didn't even realize it, and I didn't realize it, and I don't think the other people did as well. And I realized I like humor. I use it all the time, and you have to be so cautious of all of those kinds of things. And so I can only imagine the times that happened that nobody did speak up. The second thing that I made a mistake, and I've always assumed, I think we make this assumption throughout the denomination, and I don't think it's a valid one, that just because a woman is a pastor, that a woman coach would be better for them than a superintendent. And I brought a coach in, And I trusted the coach's evaluation of conversations, effectiveness, and those kinds of things, and realized now that there was jealousy, there was a whole host of things that were interactive in those things. And I actually removed a pastor one time because of the words of that coach. And I look back on that with appalling sadness. And so, I think it's the same kind of thing, thinking that a person of color needs a person of color. I think we need people with gifting. That's how I've decided after all these years. We need gifted people who care for gifted people in ways that their gifting works or connects, is interactive in some way.
Thank you, Pastor Denny.
Yeah.
You get to stay unmuted because the next question is actually for you to begin, okay?
Yes.
The question is, what kind of intentional work have you done to hear women's voices? And so let's have you begin with that question and share as you will.
And this, I understand, is kind of we get a little longer time, and I would appreciate it if, Amelia, if you cleared, if you had some question with what I'm saying, feel free to interrupt me. As I look at it, I of course am a systems thinker, and I think equality ecosystems is necessary at every level of the church, so that all systems are working to bring about equality. And let me just talk about it kind of at the 4 different levels of my life. As a local church lead pastor, everything that you do, from who's on the stage to who you're encouraging ordination, who you are asking to do what kinds of jobs, because we limit people by role and expectations and other things. And what's worse about that is that individuals limit themselves. And even though we might be open to something, they would limit themselves. And equality, that men and women and people of all backgrounds and abilities and so on would be working together. And that should happen at every level of the life of the church: the boards, the worship teams, the Bible studies, the adult leaders. All of them should get to see men and women working together in a complex mosaic of beautiful variety. And that would, of course, not just include male, female, but it would include all colors and ableness and all of those kinds of things. And I think that has to be intentional. You have to work with nominating committees. You have to work with your worship committees. I mean, musicians are people who like to have people that can play music well, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you better be bringing up a whole complexion. And so, as is done now in Santa Barbara, and was when I was pastor there, we had 9 worship teams of all different complexions and backgrounds and developments, and everybody was in process of growing in that. And I think that's an important part of it. As conference superintendent, you would think that you would have more, and then you would also think you'd have less influence because of the distance, and then the broad spectrum of churches and people. But I purposefully mentored women into ordination and into leadership, and tried to help me understand and help them understand, what does it look like for them as a person who happens to be female to have authority, and what does it look like then for others in their interaction with that, because everybody comes to it with bias. And so it's very easy for a person to not be able to live up to their potential. And so again, working with nominating committees, boards, mentoring, saying it to pastors. I'm far more interested in having personal conversations with pastors than in having learning communities and so on. And I would get together with my pastors over Zoom every 6 weeks, and we would talk through what they're doing, what's not working, how's it working, and all of those kinds of things. I also, as a superintendent, chose women to be on my regional leadership team. I just mentioned that experience, and I saw it as kind of, to use again a male model. I don't know what the female model would be. A farm system where we're bringing up people in all of these teams to become leaders. And if you've never done the superintendent work, if you've never played first base, if you've never stood at the plate, you're not going to be able to know how to do the work when your opportunity comes. And so I think there has to be a system, and we did it through the regional leadership model, where we have people involved in supervising and making the kinds of decisions that superintendents make. And I would have them help me make the decisions. They were much better decisions, especially when you have a complexion of people there. And then denominationally, I very purposefully on the study commission would nominate women. And that is very important. When we were electing GC delegates, complexion all the way through. When I was chair of the Social Action Council, which is no longer happening, I made sure that there were women and men of all backgrounds leading us nationally. And then, of course, teaching. In my pastoral counseling courses, I actually have more women, but that's because most counselors, good counselors, are women. Very sympathetic, empathetic, thoughtful. They understand power dynamics much better because they live it. And then in worship teaching, I taught at the LAMP program at Greenville for a while, and those classes I could raise up women to be worship leaders as not just saying we need to have women on the platform, but they are excellent worship leaders because they're trained. We poured into them. We give them opportunity to do it. And the last thing would be whenever I taught polity and doctrine, I would invite laity to be a part of that, and was oftentimes women who would then sit and look around at the guys that are becoming pastors and say, hey, I could do it as good as they can. And that was an eye-opening experience for many of them, that, as they say, a woman has to be an A student to get a pastorate. A guy gets it if he's a C. And that's just not good. That harms the church in a whole variety of ways. So my overall would say equality ecosystems at every aspect of the life of the church in which we have any form of power. And power should be the power to make a difference in the positive ways that God came into the world to do.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Denny. And thank you for just a lot of really practical ideas at all levels. We're going to move on to question 4, and this one's directed to Jon. Jon, I know you've answered this in one way, so we're asking you to answer it in a different way. What would you say is the biggest mistake men make when they think they're being an ally?
I'll expand a little bit more from my answers before, but I think the first thing that I wrote is thinking you're an ally and you have it together. I think a lot of times I think as Scott kind of said it in many different ways and shared really vulnerably, I think that's great, is it's hard to come to the realization that you have biases. You've lived out of these biases. You've had privilege. You've had opportunities that others hasn't had. And all of these things, then, obviously you become selfish. You think about yourself. You think about all of this. It's a question that I've went through when, I was nominated for superintendent, and having to process out if I am taking the place of a female. And the answer is yes. Because there's only one superintendent position in Southern California. And so how do I live with that tension, and how do I process that with the Lord and with my family and with what we believe our theology is? I think the other thing that I would say is I think a lot of males judge ourselves on our intent versus our impact. We make an assumption because we have good intentions. We didn't mean to be sexist. We didn't mean to be, I think Scott was bringing it up too, just our simple body language. Of course, we might not have meant to be aggressive or sexist in some way, or make quick judgment calls that probably aren't fully formed or fully thought through. But we then justify ourselves when we get feedback, or as Denny was saying, someone bring feedback, is we give ourselves a pass because we didn't mean to. What we meant was, and if they only understood what we meant, they would feel different. And the truth of the matter is they probably wouldn't, because your impact is still what was received. Their experience of you as a male in power was to take their power away in those situations. And I think the last thing that I would say is also not understanding the importance of our privilege and our biases. I think a lot of times when you're in the majority, you expect that the minority will teach you, and that it's their responsibility to teach you. So you probably have heard it a lot, in this conversation of justice with people of color, or in other situations. If we're talking about racism, it's for, people of color to teach Anglos or white individuals. I'm sorry, here comes my daughter. Lottie, can you go out with Mama, please? Sorry, that's also life too. So that's my middle daughter. Everyone wave to Charlotte. Okay, well, go find Mama. And there you go. But understanding your privilege in the sense of it's not, truthfully, the males in this room, I know we're splitting this up. This is our issue. We've held the power for 100+ years. We've made mistakes. And there's times, especially in the formation of a group like this, where women had to come together, and then it's like, okay, teach us what we are doing wrong, instead of and putting the onus back on females. You need to teach me. And so I love what Scott was saying too, of when it comes to his marriage, he owned that and tried to figure out, this is my stuff. It's not for my wife to figure out for me, and then to educate me on what I am or not supposed to be doing. And then it's up for me to either accept that as fact or accept that as reality and then move it forward. It's simply, hey, you need to do the internal work. You need to have good friends, good feedback. You need to be able to sit with that feedback too. I think we can, again, going back to the other one, I think we can judge ourselves when we receive feedback that we don't like on our intent, instead of just sitting with some of the difficulties of, we're all humans. And as Denny said, we make mistakes every day.
Thank you, John. Scott, the next question is for you. And it is, why does advocacy matter for men?
Well, I appreciate all these comments, and I'm going to touch on a couple of things that have been already shared as well. I so can resonate. Why does it matter for men? I'm going to start with 3 different paradigms, and I'm going to end sort of with the last thing that John was talking about. But I'm going to start with sort of what we would call the ontological piece. I love that word. It's taken me a long time to actually understand it. But frankly, ontologically, I'm going to just start with, we need women. Men need women. I believe that women were made to lead with men, not to serve men. We were created together to cultivate and steward the garden together. We each have gifts and talents that are unique and necessary for the flourishing of the earth. That includes our families, our churches, our places of work, our communities, all the different sectors of our economy. We need women serving with men for the good of the earth and for all the various needs that it has. So I believe that one of the very first reasons that we need to be advocates is because we need women to lead, and when they don't lead, the earth and everything in it suffers. Institutions suffer and people suffer. So I think ontologically it's bred into who women are and who men are, that we are to be working together. And that really is related to the next, which is a theological perspective. And Heather, I think, brought this up in her opening remarks about the words Ezer Kenegdo. When God made women, he gave them a very special title. And those of you that have studied this, I'll be preaching to the choir, but that word Ezer is used only 20 other places in the entire Old Testament. And in every other instance, the person being described is God himself. And not just the description of God, it's usually in the context of when you need him to come through desperately, when you need him to come through for you desperately. So just a couple of examples for that, for those of you that are wondering. There is no one like the God of Jeshurun, who rides on the heavens to help you. Blessed are you, O Israel. Who is like you, a people saved by the Lord? He is your shield and Ezer, helper, and your glorious sword. That's from Deuteronomy 33, 26, and 29. And then one of my favorite passages, Psalm 121, verses 1 and 2. I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. So as hard as it is, and I know a lot of, we can go round and round on the translation of that particular phrase and those words, I just think it's clear that it is an elevated and exclusive term, and it is related to the one that God made, God making women. So I'll leave it there for now because for the sake of time, obviously we know much more could be said. So ontological, theological, the third one I would give you, why should men be advocates, is scriptural. And I believe that this is rooted in the fact that we are all called to serve, and that includes advocacy. I was just preaching through, some of you are in the lectionary passages right now. I was just in Philippians 2 this past Sunday. So I'm just going to read. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. Not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Very familiar passage to most of us on this call. But the call to be humble servants is a call to elevate those who are around us. We are to act like Jesus. We're to be humble servants. Of course, we could go into Ephesians. We could talk about mutual submission. Scripture is just littered with the idea that we are to be more concerned with others than we are for ourselves. And that doesn't just stop at some sort of a humanitarian aid or meeting some basic needs. It's not that simplistic view of salvation that is disconnected from some kind of human flourishing. The model of Jesus was death on a cross, the ultimate sacrifice, and that was for everyone. And that, for the purposes of this discussion this evening, absolutely includes women. So part of their human flourishing, I say part of women's human flourishing, is definitely their ability to be fully human, fully themselves, fully alive, and holistically engage in the world around them. And men, I believe, need to embrace the view that women deserve all of that, just as much as any man does. So there's three big buckets there. And then this is where I'm going to pick up and draw on John's perspective. And that is that I believe that the issues around women in leadership, and we could go into gender violence and other types of things, these are truly men's issues. It's our issue. So why should men be involved? Why should they be advocates? Because it is our issue. There's a lot of people that want to kind of frame this discussion around the fact that it's a women's issue that needs some good men to come alongside. And I'm just going to kind of take a little different tack on that. And here I draw on the work of Jackson Katz, who helped me to emphasize that this is actually men's work. And the issue is, of course, patriarchy. It's power, it's privilege. And we need to recognize that any change cannot come from women simply raising awareness. Real change is going to come when men actually start changing. And we, the men, must be the ones to confront and challenge each other to look at positions of power and privilege that we hold and begin to bring the change amongst ourselves. So we need to pay attention. Questions need to be asked about men's motives. Men need to be involved in that. Any dominant group, as we know, needs to have the light shined upon it. The ability to go unexamined is the way that dominant groups maintain their power and privilege, and men must be confronted and challenged. So lacking introspection, of course, the primary issues will go unchecked, and ultimately we will leave the real issues unchanged. And then I also want to say that men are the ones that are often in the situations where the stereotypes, the demeaning language, the other behaviors that are acted out, we are the ones in those situations, and we need to be stopping it. The coarse jokes that need to be challenged, the rude behavior, the decisions that are made to elevate certain people over others. We need to be in those places, speaking up and doing the work of speaking out. So all of that, I would say. And then lastly, and I'll just kind of reframe this a little bit, it's in our own best interest. Let me just say, any man on the call tonight, it really is in our best interest. Because if you think about this, women are not the only victims of patriarchy. Young men and boys are also victims. And we just need to look at the countless headlines of those who experience abuse and evil treatment of men and realize that men not only hurt women, but they hurt men. And this becomes a generational cycle if men do not stand in the gap and advocate for themselves. Men are not just trying to raise awareness for women, but men need to become advocates for their sons and for the sake of future generations. Men must challenge the paradigms that are shaping them. And in that sense, I would say that women and men have in common that we are both victims of men who behave badly. And not to mention, men have women and girls in our lives, my own daughter, my wife, that have to live in a world where men behave badly, and we simply cannot control what might happen when. So I believe that men need to be engaged in the work of all of this for all of those reasons. And I'll just kind of close here with a quote from Martin Luther King. And he says, in the end, the thing that hurts the most is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And we know that silence becomes the voice of complicity. So men, we need to be engaged. This is our issue in a lot of ways, and we stand indebted to the women in our lives who are raising it and making us aware of it and teaching us about it, because, like I've said, I wouldn't know even what I didn't know without some of the awareness that I've learned from the women in my life. But man, we got to step up and we got to do the part that we can do. So
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott. That's really good. I one small correction. I got credited with a Hebrew interpretation I didn't introduce. That came from Dr. Laura Hunt at the beginning there.
Oh, dude, I'm sorry. Yes, that was Laura. All right. Sorry about that, Laura.
Last question that we have on the books here, which will be directed to Jeffrey. And this question comes with an assumption that I think speaks to how the authors were feeling and even crafting this question, that we've had a movement towards multiplication, growth, efficiency, which when that's moving, it can seem like male leaders are getting prioritized in those movements. So how can we work to dismantle barriers to advocacy due to being in a system that values multiplication or growth or efficiency over developing both male and female leaders?
I think that we need to, something that I'm focused on a lot lately is shifting a narrative. The narrative on what is important, the narrative on what should be done, the narrative on what is possible, and being intentional. So some of the other previous questions lead into this, into the answer to this for me. We work to dismantle barriers by learning from our mistakes and hearing from others of the mistakes that have been made. I think it was John that talked about how we may say, well, I didn't intend to do it that way, or that was not the intent of a policy. But when we see that our policies, our practices in the church are harmful, that we shift them and we learn from our mistakes. And to do that, we need to be in conversation with women. Now, there has been some teaching that some men came up through, that you don't have close relationships with women in your church, with women on your staff. You don't find yourselves in a singular space with women. And I think that leads into this perspective of the temptress. You have to watch yourself, men. I think we need to have conversations with women. I benefit richly from the conversations of Reverend Dr. Laura Hunt, who is the associate pastor at New Beginnings. And we have honest, open conversations. I think one thing we also do is we value the voice. The voices of women who are advocating for themselves. We sometimes can want to still quash them because it's hard to hear. And I could borrow that from the language of the angry Black man. And we've got derogatory names for women who are forceful, assertive, self-determined, that are advocate for themselves. And we need to be, men need to not only be able to hear these voices as they present themselves, but help other men to hear them as well. So we elevate the voices of women in the conversations that we're in and in the spaces that we're in, or their perspectives, even when they're not there. Somebody mentioned, the joking that happens when it's all the guys. Well, that's a time when we can shut down some of the negative things we hear and elevate the voices of women. When we're talking institutional and the whole issue of multiplication and growth and efficiency, I don't think that we will be able to grow this denomination without full inclusion of voices. We're not going to be able to do that with a white male dominated structure. That's just not going to get us anywhere because the society is not there and people are looking for different things. And so as I looked at myself when my 30 years at the University of Michigan in student academic affairs, probably for 21 of those years, my directors were women. And 2 of my deans were women. And so to see that in your workspace and think you're going to come into a church space where that is not replicated, and now we're supposed to wear this vest of male privilege. A lot of men are not going to go and buy that, and a whole bunch of women are not going to buy that. I think we changed the definition of justice and ministerial misconduct. I hear horrific stories from women I know in ministry about the thing male pastors do that get no discipline for it, none at all. However, if they were caught outside in the parking lot drinking with a 40, okay, then it's time to shift the pastor and get rid of them. But they can do horrific things, say horrific things to women, marginalize them in horrific ways, and nothing is said to them. And so that leads into another institutional change. We deal with this stuff from the beginning. We have all types of incubators now, all types of assessments that we're sending folks through. And when in that, we pick up that we have this attitude of patriarchy or that of inequality. Why do we proceed with that any further? That should be something to say, look, we are a denomination that believes in the full inclusion of women. If that is not where your head is, this is not the denomination for you. And to be honest with you, that's not just with the men, but it's with the women who think they're the exception. Okay, I'm the exception to the rule because it's kind of like me because I'm different than all those other women, or want to come in because they don't mind taking the lesser seat. And if they get in, they're going to help work to make sure that women take the lesser seat. And the other thing, I think that we can elevate voices of women in conversation, in leadership, how we back them up. And so maybe to put it on the spot right here, would we give Bishop K charge over the Reach Conference? We look and say, look, we've got a woman bishop. Would we give her the authority over the largest churches in the denomination? Or will we say, well, the fellas really ain't ready for that? Okay. They may not be ready, but how do you ever get ready? And so I think we need to change our narrative, change our structure, how we what we have in terms of what's coming out of training for ordination, what the classes are, what the required reading is. This is how you make intentional structural change. Because if you don't do things intentionally,
they won't happen.
Ain't gonna happen. Okay, this is just not gonna happen because folks wake up one day and say, wow, I think I'm gonna be an inclusive male. It just ain't gonna happen. Black folks still wait on that, by the way, for that wake-up call. But it ain't gonna happen, people.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
All right, it's gonna take me a minute to get rid of all the spotlights here. Maybe they'll go away by themselves when I share my screen. We're gonna shift gears and just wrap up by learning something from the audience. And we had 2 questions for our audience. One of them was for the women in the audience specifically. What is one thing you wish male advocates knew? And that's the question we're going to look at first. I've been reading them ahead of time, and I'll tell you right now that as someone who has experienced some of these things, and also even more heartbreakingly watched people I care about experience some of these things, I get a little emotional reading them, but I'm going to take us through the difficult things first, the things that women in the audience have not seen and wish they would see. The first one's very simple. I wish men wouldn't call us girls. I wish men would learn how to give us credit for our ideas and work instead of taking it. I wish that more men understood the vast difference in power dynamics for men and women. I wish male advocates understood that no matter how great of an advocate they are, they still have blind spots. I wish male advocates advocated for and did the work to fix pay disparity and family leave policies. I wish men wouldn't turn a blind eye to bad behavior and allow it to create a hostile work and ministry environment for women. I wish FMC leaders could see all the invisible women leaders who have disappeared from ministry because of experiences like Tasha's from their local elders or superintendents. I wish male pastors were more diligent with the responsibility to prepare churches for a future woman pastor. I wish they knew that supporting women goes so much deeper than simply affirming our ordination. It requires rooting out biases, intentionality, sacrificial giving, etc. I wish men wouldn't say they advocate for women in church leadership, but refuse to coach or mentor them. I wish men knew how much they assume they are normal. I wish, like the person who said it before, and I'm sure many others, that men would be more intentional about getting their church ready for a woman pastor. I wish advocates would put women out there for positions at larger churches and in higher levels of leadership. We have a pipeline issue, and I would love to know if you are putting women out there when asked. We hire through word of mouth in our denom. And how are you stepping down or lifting up so we look like the beliefs we have? I wish more churches were regularly exposed to women preachers, so it's not so shocking to them to invite a woman into their leadership. And now let's look at the good news. These are, again, from the women in our group, in our audience. How have you seen male advocates effectively making space for you and other women? I've seen pastors have women preach, not just when they're gone. I've seen both men and women advocate for each other in difficult spaces. I've seen a man offer me opportunities that he was offered, and it created a chance for me to have great experiences in ministry and to create a greater network of mentors and champions for me. I wish men would know that treating us like a guy or one of the guys is not the healthy way to be an advocate for the unique strengths of women. I've seen men who listen when they are called out for sexism, who repent, and who change. I've seen men pastors be incredibly intentional about addressing me as their pastor and seeking my authority. That's it. Katie?
So just to wrap up, thank you all for being here tonight and for taking part in this conversation, for hearing. We realized that there was so much more that could be said. We're really just scratching the surface. You'll see in the chat just some resources and some follow-up. So if you are a man who's here tonight and you think, I want to continue on that journey of advocacy, we have a resource page specifically on our website on how to be a better advocate, right? Some intentional ways, some maybe things that you haven't thought about before. So reading is a great place to get started and to continue to have those conversations. We'll also send all of this out in a follow-up email to everyone who registered. For the women who are here in this space tonight, we'd love for you to get more involved in AWL. So we have an interest form for anyone who thinks they might be want to volunteer or get involved in some way. It's like a 2-minute survey you can fill out via Google Forms. Tell us a little bit more about you and maybe see some ways that you can get involved in AWL. And for everyone, whether you are a man or a woman, we'd love to have you subscribe to our newsletter so you can keep up on our happenings, on new things that are happening if we're adding to our resources or anything like that. And check out our website. Our website has so many resources and ways to continue this conversation. So we also recognize that we had a list of set questions that we asked, and we were very limited by time. If you think, wow, I really wish there was a certain question that they would have asked or the men would have answered, please feel free when we send out our follow-up email. We'll invite feedback. So if you think that there was a question you really wish that you had heard tonight and you didn't hear it, let us know. And if we get enough of those, maybe we'll have a panel part 2. You never know. So so check your emails. We'll be sending out follow-up with all of the resources and links that were shared tonight. And thank you so much for joining us. This is just a small part of a conversation that's designed to be ongoing, and we are grateful for everyone who's willing to have it.